folks, HR Funk here, with a video comparison today between two pistols with a lot of similarities. For example, they both chamber the exact same 9mm Parabellum cartridge. They both feature Walther-inspired first shot double action and successive shot single action trigger systems. They both use staggered double column magazines with about the same capacity. They both have loyal followings, and they both distinguish themselves in the service of military organizations and law enforcement agencies around the world. What I have here today, folks, are the Beretta M9 service pistol and the CZ75. Now, this video could be looked at a little bit as an East versus West competition as well, because as many of you know, the CZ75 was originally devised and adopted behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia, and the M9 Beretta was developed and eventually adopted by the United States military and has served as our standard issue military pistol up until just recently when it was replaced by the SIG 320. Now, at the time both of these pistols were adopted, the Cold War was really at its height. And both of these pistols could be looked at as Cold Warriors, if you will, because each was expected, on the part of its respective government, to give that military organization an advantage if the operation came down to the use of pistols. So as I compare and contrast the features and functions of these two pistols, I want to stack up the pluses and minuses and see if either one of these Cold Warriors really does have a distinct advantage. So here we go. In the interest of full disclosure, I want to point out here at the beginning of the video that while my Beretta pistol really is an M9, my CZ75 is the CZ75 Omega convertible. As such, it has some updated parts in the trigger system, and it has an updated safety that can be used as a decocker. That is different from the original pistols that were adopted back in the mid-1970s. So as I go through my comparison, I'm going to try to avoid commenting on any of the updated features of the CZ75 Omega convertible and just stick to the features and characteristics that would be the same as those pistols from back during the Cold War. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get on with the comparison. Before we look at the pistols themselves, let's talk about the magazines. Obviously, a semi-auto pistol is only as reliable as the magazine that it uses. In the case of our two Cold Warriors, they both use staggered double column magazines inspired by the Browning High Power. In the case of the M9 Beretta, it is a 15-shot magazine, and in the case of the CZ75, it is a 16-shot magazine. So there is a one-round advantage going to CZ in terms of magazine capacity. Now, many of you know recently Beretta has updated their magazines, and they now hold 17 rounds in the M9 magazine. But back during the Cold War, which is the era we're looking at, there was a one-round magazine capacity advantage going to the CZ75. Now, when we're talking 15, 16, 17 rounds, one round either way is not a huge advantage, but it is an advantage nonetheless. In terms of reliability, both of these magazines are known for being very reliable. Now, there were some issues recently in our military operations with the M9 where sand got into the magazines of the pistols and caused some functioning problems. But as I understand it, the magazines that were involved in that were not Beretta magazines. They were magazines from another vendor that supplies magazines to the U.S. military. And Beretta, to their credit, stepped up and replaced those defective magazines with brand new magazines of their own with a new special coating to make them more resistant to problems from the sand. So again, looking back to the Cold War era, two very reliable magazines with a one-round advantage going to the CZ. In terms of construction, we find our first big difference between the two pistols. The CZ75 is an all-steel construction. It is steel slide and barrel and steel frame, whereas the M9 Beretta has the steel slide and barrel, but an alloy frame. Now, this does result in the M9 being slightly lighter than the CZ75, but the difference is not as much as you might expect. Now, all else being equal, a lighter firearm in military operations would be preferable to one that's heavier, but here again, there's not that much difference, and all things are not equal. What I mean by that is because of the materials used in construction, the all-steel frame of the CZ75, and particularly its grip profile, can be made to a slightly lesser dimension than the M9 Beretta. That means that when you wrap your hand around the CZ75, particularly if you don't have extremely large hands, it fits a little bit better than the M9 Beretta because it has to be a little bit bigger around because of the added material to give the necessary strength to the alloy frame. Now in a couple of minutes I'm going to put these two pistols on the scale and we're going to see exactly how much difference there is in terms of weight between the two. And first up on the official Cabela's scale is the CZ75. With the magazine in place, the all-steel pistol is weighing in at 2 pounds 6 ounces, which for an all-steel pistol of this vintage sounds just about right. Now let's swap it out with the M9 Beretta and see how it weighs in. And the M9 has now taken its place on the scale, and again with the magazine in place, it's weighing in at exactly 2 pounds. So there's a 6 ounce difference between the M9 and the CZ75, which, as I said before, is not as much as you might expect between the all-steel CZ75 and the alloy frame Beretta, but that's what the scale is showing us. Continuing on, let's talk about the feel of the pistol in the hand, shooter interface, and ergonomics. Now, as I already pointed out, the grip circumference of the CZ75 is somewhat less than the Beretta M9, and because of that, and the grip contour that you can see here, the CZ75 fits the hand very, very well. And because of its lesser grip circumference, you don't have to have tremendously large hands to get a good grip on the pistol. Because of all that, the CZ75 points extremely naturally. In fact, the Browning High Power is really the only pistol I know of that feels a little bit better and points a little bit more naturally than the CZ75, and it's only a very slight advantage that goes to the Browning High Power. The CZ75 feels very good. The controls are extremely easy to reach. The slide stop, as you can see, is extended somewhat so that it's very easy to bring your thumb up and lock the slide back. If you're going to use it to release the slide, again, that's a very easy reach. The magazine release is very easy to reach. You don't have to shift the pistol in your hand to drop the magazine. And the safety, again, this is not the same safety as was on the original CZ75s, but if it was, it's also very easy to reach that frame-mounted safety. So, because of all those characteristics, the user interface and the ergonomics of the CZ75 are very good. Now let's take a look at the M9. The Beretta M9 is no slouch in the area of ergonomics and user interface, but again, we've got that greater grip circumference. Now it does have a nice grip contour that fills the hand well, but you do have to have slightly larger hands to get a good grip on the M9 than you do with the CZ75. Now you can see once again the slide stop is extended back to a point where it's very easy to reach and to activate with the thumb. Or if you're going to use it to release the slide, that's a very easy reach. The safety is easy to reach. It's a little longer reach than it is with the CZ75 because of the frame-mounted safety on the CZ, but it's still not difficult to reach the safety on the Beretta. The magazine release, as you saw, I have to turn the pistol slightly in order to actuate the magazine release, and that's because of that greater grip circumference. So, while the Beretta M9 is not bad in terms of ergonomics, I'm going to give the advantage in terms of ergonomics and shooter interface to the CZ75. Let's talk about safeties for a minute. The original CZ75 had a safety that was similar to the 1911 pistol. What I mean by that is when a loaded magazine was inserted into the pistol and a round was cycled into the chamber, the hammer would stay cocked, just like the hammer on my pistol here. The safety could then be engaged and the pistol could be safely carried with that hammer in a cocked position. This is known as carrying the pistol cocked and locked. When the shooter would produce the pistol before it could be fired, the safety had to be disengaged, just like with the 1911, and then the first shot would be fired single action, as would each successive shot after that. Now, the CZ75 offered another means to deploy the pistol. That is with the first shot being fired double action. However, those original capacities, unlike my Omega convertible, did not have a means to decock the pistol. I can safely lower the hammer via the decocker with this pistol. On the original CZ75s, the only way to lower that hammer was to physically hold onto the hammer and release the trigger and then ease the hammer forward. Or another method to do it would be to place your thumb, if I can do this so you can see it, between the rear of the slide and the hammer and release the trigger. Now I've taken my finger completely off the hammer and I'm going to ease that trigger forward as I remove my thumb. Excuse me, ease the hammer forward as I remove my thumb, so that it's now in a decocked position. From this condition, as the shooter would produce the pistol, the first shot would be fired double action, and then as the pistol would cycle, each successive shot would be fired single action. The only problem with this method of deploying the CZ75 was that no matter how you physically lowered the hammer, there was always some danger that if your grip would slip or your thumb would slip or something like that, you could inadvertently discharge the pistol. So now let's contrast that system with the Beretta M9. With the M9, there is no means to carry the pistol cocked and locked. When a loaded magazine is inserted and the slide is cycled, the hammer does stay cocked, and the Beretta safety doubles as a decocker. So as I rotate it down, I can safely drop the hammer. The pistol would not discharge even if a round was in the chamber. And then I move the safety back up, and it's now in a position to fire that first shot in a double action mode. And each shot after that is fired single action. Now obviously, if you're conducting an emergency reload in the heat of battle, you would not conduct your reload, decock the safety, and then fire that first round double action. You would just reload the pistol and start to fire with it in a single action mode. But there is no way to carry the pistol safely with the hammer cocked. There's no means for doing that with the Beretta safety. Now opinions on these two safeties go back and forth. And I really think a lot of this comes down to personal preference and training. There are some folks that prefer to carry the CZ75 in a cocked and locked manner so that they never have to concern themselves with that long, heavy double action trigger pull. They prefer to deploy the pistol, disengage the safety just like you would with a 1911, and fire their shots single action, which the CZ does allow. However, there are other folks that prefer the greater safety allowed by that first shot double action, and they don't want to physically have to go through the rigmarole of trying to lower the hammer without discharging the pistol. Those folks come down on the side of the Beretta M9. Again, opinions go back and forth on this, and it all comes down to personal preference and safety. If you train with the CZ system, and I'm talking about the original CZ system, not the CZ Omega convertible that I have here. If you train with that and you're competent with it, I don't see a problem with using it in either mode, probably the cocked and locked most likely. If not, if you prefer the double action first shot and you train with this pistol and you get to the point where you can reliably place that first double action shot, handle the trigger transition, and then keep your shots on target with the single action pull afterwards, then the Beretta is just fine. So I think I'm going to call the trigger action between the two, or maybe I should say the safety action between the two, a draw. One last thing before I leave safeties. With the M9, there is a concern when conducting a reload that if you use an overhand grip in order to cycle the slide, you can, just as I did there, inadvertently engage the safety, meaning the trigger is now disabled. Because of that, there are some people who are proponents of dropping the slide on the M9 after a reload with the slide stop. This is a fine motor skill. It does require more training than just grabbing the slide and cycling it, but doing so would alleviate the possibility of inadvertently applying the safety. Now Beretta in the updated M9A3 has changed the safety to make it less likely that this can occur, but it is something to keep in mind if you're using the M9. In terms of barrel length, folks, there is a measurable difference between the M9 and the CZ75. The CZ75 has a 4.6 inch barrel, whereas the M9 has a 4.9 inch barrel, so about 3/10 of an inch difference between the two. Interestingly though, even though the Beretta's barrel is longer, the sight radius between the two is about the same. Reason being, and I'll try to hold these where you can see them. Reason being, the front sight on the Beretta is slightly back from the end of the muzzle because the slide doesn't extend all the way to the end of the muzzle, and the front sight is attached to the front of the slide. Whereas on the CZ75, the front sight is all the way out at the end of the slide, and the slide is just about to the end of the barrel. So for that reason, the sight radius again is about the same. The CZ75 that I have here does not have the style of sights that were on the original pistol. This is an updated 3-dot version, whereas the M9 has the traditional, or at least traditional as far as the US military is concerned, 2-dot system, which has been on there since the pistol was originally adopted. For that reason, I would give a little bit of an edge to the Beretta in terms of sights, because they have sights that could be picked up more quickly than the original CZ75s had. I don't believe they had any markings at all on the very first ones that were issued to the militaries. But it's a slight advantage, but an advantage nonetheless for the Beretta. Let's talk about another difference between our two Cold Warriors, folks. That being the bore axis. Bore axis is simply the height of the bore, or the height of the center line of the bore, above the shooter's grip. Because of the inverted rails on the CZ75, the bore, and actually the slide itself, sit lower in the frame and closer to the shooter's hand than does the M9 Beretta. And I'm going to try to line up the slide grooves on both of these, and you can see, if I can get them closely approximated there, how much lower the bore of the CZ75 is as opposed to the M9 Beretta. Now what this means is the CZ75 is going to tend to have a little bit less muzzle flip while the shooter is firing than the M9. And that's going to be even more so because this pistol is a little bit heavier than the M9. That translates to slightly faster follow-up shots and more quick target acquisition between shots with the CZ75 than you would get with the M9 Beretta. So I'm going to give a slight advantage in rate of fire, or maybe I should say accurate rate of fire, to the CZ75 as opposed to the M9. Now we're going to take that to the test when we get out to the range and see which one of these pistols actually shoots better. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the triggers. In terms of trigger pull, you're going to have to take these results with a grain of salt. As I said at the beginning of the video, this is the CZ75 Omega convertible, and the Omega trigger system is an updated and improved version of the CZ75 trigger. So as I test it subjectively, the double action pull feels very good. A little bit gritty, but all in all not bad, and the pull is not overly heavy. The single action pull is extremely light. I've always noticed that about this particular pistol. And we're going to check this in just a minute on the Lyman trigger scale and see exactly where the double action and single action trigger are breaking. But before I do that, I'm going to grab my Beretta M9 and similarly test the trigger on this pistol. And I can already tell the trigger pull on the M9 feels longer for the double action pull than it does with the CZ75. It's very smooth. It's actually a little bit smoother than the CZ75, but it feels longer and heavier. The single action pull has a very good let off, but it also feels heavier than the CZ75. So now I'm going to grab the Lyman trigger scale and we're going to see exactly where these two triggers are breaking. And first up is the double action pull of the CZ75. And it's coming in at about 10.5 pounds, 10 pounds, 7.5 ounces. Now let's try the single action pull. Single action pull is coming in at about 3 3/4 pounds, so a little less than 4 pounds for the single action pull on the CZ75. Now let's compare that to the M9. And here we go with the double action pull on the M9. And it's coming in just under 12 pounds. We've got 11 pounds, 15.7 ounces. I think for all intents and purposes we can call that 12 pounds for the double action pull on the M9. Now let's check the single action pull. A little over 5 pounds. 5 pounds 2.7 or 5 pounds 2.6 ounces. So both the double action pull and the single action pull are better on the CZ75, but again, this is the CZ75 with the Omega trigger. If I had two surplus service pistols here, then the trigger pulls would probably be closer, but my guess would be the CZ75 would probably have a slightly better pull in both single and double action modes. Since I don't though, I'm not going to give a clear advantage either way. This test was basically just to satisfy my own curiosity to see where the triggers on these respective pistols were breaking. So that's it for the indoor comparison of our two Cold Warrior pistols, folks. Next stop is going to be the range, where the proof is in the pudding, or the proof is in the shooting, and we're going to see how each one of these performs, and again, try to see if we can answer that question as to which one of our Cold War pistols gave their respective troops the greatest advantage.